Hello and welcome. My name is Hari Dilip Kumar, and I'm really happy to be presenting the DAV Data Solutions Data4SDG Thought Leaders interview series. Today, I'm thrilled to be chatting with Sruthi Kutty, who is an independent consultant but has had loads of experience. Shruti is a gender and policy professional whose work has spanned various roles in development and government in the consulting realms. She's worked with several Indian states, with government bodies, policy think tanks, non-profits. She's had a chance to work on a range of issues, closely engaging with key actors like community leaders, bureaucrats, elected representatives, and citizens at large. Apart from her professional endeavors, she's also keen on connecting with people working in gender justice and exploring feminist perspectives in everyday life. So thrilled to have you, Shruti, and you're the second, policy governance development specialist who we're talking to, at least I'm talking to on this series. So let's start with your journey. So Shruti, you've had an interesting journey. You started off as an engineer, and then you got into media and publishing, and now you're following your own pathway and forging your own path in a really intersectional sort of career of policy, governance, and gender. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you have thought about your career choices and how you've come here from there.
Yeah. So thanks for that introduction. Thanks for having me here today. Like you said, I am an engineer by degree, qualification, whatever, because at least when I was younger, at the age of 17, I had no idea how to figure out what I wanted to do for the rest of my life for a living or whatever. So I did engineering because that seemed like the easiest option. I don't know, some might disagree, it's not the easiest option, but it just seemed like something that I could go with. And I did my bachelor's in electronics and telecommunication engineering. And frankly, it's not that I'm somebody who hates engineering or anything, but it didn't really interest me much. So once I finished my degree, I didn't really want to immediately go into another master's or something like that without thinking things through. And I think that's a struggle that a lot of young people go through. When I talk to younger people now, my cousins and younger friends, that how do you figure out what you want to do? Especially in India, I think there are no channels or avenues to figure out what it is that you're good at, and you're wasting your time away doing something that you're not fit to do, but you have to because you have to be a part of the employable workforce or whatever. So instead of jumping into another master's or something, I thought of doing a job which wasn't really related to engineering. It was publishing, as you mentioned, because it was something that interested me, and it was a fun job, a light job, but it kind of gave me money. I wasn't sitting at home doing nothing, but also I took that time to read, speak to people, figure out what it is that I wanted to do. I think I always had an inclination towards the humanities, but I was never acquainted so well with social sciences. But then while I was working in publishing, I took that time out, about a year and a half, to figure out what I wanted to do. That's how I switched to the social development sector. I did a PG Diploma in development communication, so communication for development. It's basically a tool that UNICEF uses to bring about social behavioral change behavior change through communication. So that was a very hands-on course. We were on field all the time. It was almost like learning on the job. From the very first day, we were in a Bombay Municipal Corporation school, working with children, working with communities, working on gender. That was my introduction to gender as well. Then I worked on a few projects with NABARD, the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. After which I went on to be really honest, it's not that I planned this out. I kind of went with the flow, which is why there are a lot of things, like it's all over the place. It's not a very smooth trajectory. It's very tumultuous, actually. So I went on to work on a research and develop documentation project with Maharashtra State Road Development Corporation. Okay. It was basically a highway project. It was a typical infrastructure project, but my role was to work with the primary landowners, that is the farmers, work with bureaucrats from the revenue department and MSRDC stakeholders themselves, elected representatives, panchayat presidents and all of that. It was a big project which required massive amounts of land. So there's a huge factor, the human aspect to a developmental project, documenting that. That was my first real groundwork in the dev sector.
Yeah.
Which is when I felt like, oh, this is something I'd like to do. I want to learn more about it. And because I am an engineer with just a diploma, I didn't really have any theoretical grounding.
Yeah.
So I felt like I should do a master's. So I went on to do a master's in public policy and governance, which is now a very upcoming degree, as I see it. Not when I applied for it or where I chose to do it. Now I'm seeing a lot of interest in this particular area, probably because there is a renewed or a rising increase amongst youngsters in being a part of the policy making process, I believe. I don't know what the reason is, but I see that that is happening. That is... when I switched to that particular master's, I see public policy as a small subset of the development sector, the larger development sector. Like maybe we could call it a solution-oriented subset of development. During my master's, I was in... Sorry?
No, please go on. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting perspective. Because
Sorry.
I'm also one of those kind of like skill stacked people. So I also started off as a electronics and communication engineer, and in fact got a master's in that. And I got into public policy relatively late in my career, and I'm not 100% into it, but I can speak that language now. Why do you say that public policy is just a small part of the development sector? I mean, wouldn't one assume that it's an all-encompassing sort of thing where whether you are aware of it or not, your life is touched by countless policies which are formulated by people who you don't even know, right?
Yeah. So what I meant is, okay, so the development field itself has a lot of different courses like the public policy, Masters in Development Studies, Sociology, Anthropology. So there's always this confusion between people who are doing development studies and public policy, this debate. And some students argue that development is public policy is different from development. This is coming from the master's discourse actually. But I personally thought I couldn't separate the two. Like you said, social development sector has a lot of stakeholders, lot of different kind of work that's happening, whether it's the non-profits, community-based organizations, grassroots activism, all of that is a part of the development paradigm. The public policy bit is a subset of that big paradigm is what I meant. I don't look at it as a different universe. It's a part of the same universe, even as a discipline. And if one does not understand core concepts of the development sector, of development studies, I feel you will fail as a policy practitioner, because that's where that out of touch with ground reality happens, because policy is made in closed rooms, right? But So I feel like there has to be a conversation, and I see that policy has to be a culmination of a very grounded understanding of all range of developmental issues. So when I meant it's a subset, I did, okay.
I understand. So it's coming out of a discourse, but your feeling is that one needs to be a kind of universal thinker in order to engage into policy, and especially well-grounded in development as well. Without which there will be a failure to produce outcomes, because you can't sit in a room and make rules for communities thousands of kilometers away or whatever without having some practical grounding. So totally with you there. I think it's a fascinating journey, and like I said, I also have some kind of stacking just like this. I didn't go for a master's course, but I spent about 2 years working exclusively on policy governance and advocacy and evidence-based research. So very fascinating story. So coming to this in your current role, right? Like you've done a lot of stuff. Your latest work was with the Gender Park, and then can you describe the kinds of stakeholders you work with? I'm getting the feeling that you're a very people and institutions kind of person. Multi-stakeholder engagement is something which you've been doing since early in your career. So who are the stakeholders who you work with now? And now that you have like a mature grasp of how to do what it is that you do, like how do you create value for these stakeholders, either by yourself or in the teams you work with? Could you share that with us?
Yeah. So of late, I think in my last job and the one before that, they were mostly bodies, autonomous bodies, but government bodies, in the sense that our day-to-day activities would not be dictated by government schemes or anything. We were independent in that sense, but they were mostly like Section 8 public companies. So most of the stakeholders largely were mostly bureaucrats, or some technical experts, but by technical I don't necessarily mean in the sense of a particular field. Like if it's gender part, then it used to be people who have some expertise in the field of gender, both policymakers to people in the academia to different kinds of stakeholders, but largely experts and bureaucrats. Before that, I've worked a lot with communities, like you said, working with people. I think it's important that we work with both these sets of, if you're dividing it largely into experts and people, communities, it's important to work with both, because if you can be that intermediary, it really helps adding value for both these stakeholders. Right. If you have to convince a very senior bureaucrat about some idea that you have, it can't only be based on what you read in a textbook or what you read in a research paper, because even they could have read it. If you can match that up with some anecdotal evidence that you heard from somebody you interacted with in the community, it's really empowering, because then it's your unique story, it's your unique input. Right, that's important. Similarly, if you have some understanding of why certain policies are broken or why it's not reaching, and if you can communicate that very well with the communities, they might also be willing to tell you, oh, but maybe you should do this differently, and then it might work. So I think I like to be somewhere in the middle there.
That's really interesting, because I believe one of the functions of the civil space, right, of the civil society space in which you probably will fall, is to perform that translation between public policy and the governance on the ground, right? Both ways, you're doing it with the communities, advocating with them, but you're also advocating with the bureaucrats, and you're leveraging the technical experts so that you can have some, experience on your side when you go and engage. What are the so since we have a diverse audience for these podcasts, like people who are interested in data, people who are interested in SDGs, and people who are looking for opportunities, what are the concrete types of value propositions which you have? Why do bureaucrats give you audience? Is it because you contextualize development for them, or is it because you solve a problem which is too hard for them to solve by themselves, or is it because they themselves are proactive and see the need for multi-stakeholder engagement, and therefore they view you as a kind of trusted intermediary between you and the actual beneficiaries of development? Just maybe share a couple of points on that.
So I think if you're talking about how to have let's say a pitch, if you're talking to a bureaucrat, I would not say that with people, with a bureaucrat. I think our understanding of Indian bureaucracy is also, I feel like it's very stereotypical, because you can't box the Indian bureaucrat. There's went into it thinking that you could, but they are a very difficult species to decipher. They're all different. There is context involved in who you're dealing with also. I think you need to understand the person first and then decide how you want to convince them. In this context, I think data is key in terms of the fact that they're very busy people. If you want to convince them that there is a problem, showing them that through a pie chart or a graph or something like that is very simple and very effective. You say that, look, this, I feel like for me, whether it's report writing or convincing somebody to take up a project, everything should be a story, and sometimes data is a very good opener to a story.
Understood.
Like you show them a graph and then tells you what the problem is, then hopefully they'd want to know why and how we can solve it. So in that sense, that's one way to pitch it with let's say decision makers, not just bureaucrats. It could be elected representative, anybody. With people, I think you might want them to be your audience, but I have always felt like it's better to be an audience yourself, because there's so much to learn over there. There is better to be a listener than going and just telling everything that you've read in textbooks that is not a lived experience for you.
Right.
I mostly shut up with people.
No, that's fascinating. I think like bringing people into the design process of the policies which are going to affect them, right? It needs a lot of listening and empathy to do. So those are very valuable points. So of course, this is a Data4SDG call and podcast. And what I'm understanding is that you build narratives, kind of like an extension of your, or like a maturing of your communications background. And you sometimes data becomes useful in creating these narratives and convincing very busy people to give you audience and engage your ideas into whatever it is they're doing. So can you share with us maybe a story or two of how you have interacted with data as you create these narratives over the years? I know we had a previous conversation where you were talking about your early experience, for example, and your work with land perhaps. So could you talk a little bit about where in the course of your duty you come in contact with data, perhaps with some practical examples?
Yeah, so I think data, if in the policy and governance realm, or pretty much everywhere, there is. It's impossible to navigate a day without data. You don't realize how much data that you're consuming
right.
Day in and day out. Also, we need to understand the data. The minute you say data, everybody imagines an Excel sheet or a spreadsheet. Data is also qualitative in nature. There's both kinds of data, and both are integral to the existence of each other, or at least for any consequential work to happen, it has to be a conversation between the two kinds of data. In my experience, I think one thing that I could probably talk about is on land rights. I remember doing a project on women's land rights, and the biggest challenge there were numbers. There were all kinds of numbers, but the problem was that we didn't have precise numbers of women's land ownership. Both in terms of how many women own land and in terms of how much land each of them own. So, and this is a struggle with a lot of data related to gender, because there is a lack of gender disaggregated data. So you often use proxies, like with the national census, you use data for, like, let's say there's a female-headed household, and whatever land ownership comes under the female-headed household is considered as, women's land ownership. So basically, and then this goes into reports and this goes into the evidence, but it's not really complete evidence. And then so that is a major issue, and you don't realize how these things play out, because I think I don't know if we discussed this, but there's also the problem of absolute data vacuum when it comes to transgender persons. That's an even bigger issue now. With women, I think because of the discourse of women's rights over the last decades, it has reached somewhere. It's still not reached anywhere where we want it to be.
So this is an extremely important point, which I think, it's like the structures of the world, right? Like the power structures, even the algorithms in Google or the laws which have been made, if they've been made without with data on certain parts of the community is missing, right? Then it's like really, it's like the old saying, it's like a man's world, right? Like, because it was never designed for, if they don't show up, if transgenders don't show up in the data, then how can somebody in policy, for example, design for them, right?
I think if I can just draw from that point, there was recently a case, a PIL in the High Court of Kerala. So basically, it was a trans woman stating that she wants to be a part of the NCC, right? The National Cadet Corps, based on the legislation dating back to, I think it's just post-independence. I don't remember the date, the year. It follows simple categorization of male and female. Now, this particular trans woman, she said that I want to be a part. She's taken admission in the University College in Kerala as a transgender woman. She has a transgender ID card assigned to her. But then the confusion is, where do we put her? Okay, she is enrolled as a transgender person. And it's not my confusion, to be clear, it's the confusion from the side of the institution. They said that we won't be able to give you a place here because there is no categorization as transgender persons in the NCC Act. So she had to actually go file a PIL and all of that. So there's so much conversation about legislations and all of that. Just putting transgender persons in the drop-down menu does not really solve, it's not a solution or a gender sensitive approach to policy making. During the court case itself, the NCC councils, if I'm not wrong, argued that we are not against giving transgender persons a place in the NCC, but because there is a lack of data and lack of number of people, transgender persons who want to join the NCC, we haven't actually made provisions to ensure the safety of everyone involved. And to be honest, I'm watering it down. The argument itself was very insensitive to the whole of trans community. So I'm watering it down. So I'm saying that is the attitude that we go with. Sometimes it's not just that you need disaggregated data. And by disaggregated, I feel going forward, it should not just be in binary, because you are also now negotiating this space policy, the whole world actually, not this space, with a younger generation that is much more in touch with ideas of gender identity. These are not struggles that people from our generation didn't have, but they didn't have the access to language, didn't have access to civil society organizations, support groups, which now younger generation has. They will demand it at some point. So it's very irresponsible if we don't foresee that need and act accordingly. So I know these are difficult things to achieve.
They're very difficult to, because one can take the issue of fighting for a gender identity, right, and for the recognition of that gender identity, but then translating it into action. There are no best practices, I guess, for so many things. How should transgender toilets be designed, right? Should it be the men's room, the women's room, or the transgender's room, or something else, or unisex toilets?
No, I think when it comes to such conversations, I usually take a step back, because I feel like when there's a conversation about, let's say, anything that a cis woman needs, I personally don't like that conversation to be driven by men. So if this is a conversation with trans persons, I usually take it, because there are a lot of transgender rights activists who have suggested gender neutral toilets, and there are things you can do. Listen to us. So maybe that's a conversation that we need to listen to transgender persons talk about. I feel like there is a solution to everything. It may not seem easy at the start, but if there's a will, it can happen. It's doable.
Yeah, understood. So I think it is a complex question, and it's really a problem for policymakers to. One is if they really do they really see the need to do this? I mean, given that they are less sensitized to these issues than the younger generation, who maybe not in policy decision making power right now. And the other is, once they do recognize the need to design for these new kinds of intersectional use cases, sort of arising out of gender, out of a gender justice perspective, then how do they do this in a way that respects all the stakeholders and fits within their? So it's I can just see that it's not an easy question to talk about, but the first step perhaps is to collect data on the kinds of communities and issues which they are facing, and then from there present a case to sort of work with the necessary stakeholders to solve for this. So that's really fascinating. I mean, it's I'm sure you've had a lot of different experiences of this kind. Could you talk a little more about a very important point, which I think is missed by many people who have been sort of overwhelmed by the big data wave, which is, quality also matters, right? Not just quantity. So can you talk about the qualitative aspects perhaps, and give a couple of examples where, the two went hand in hand, perhaps in some research cycles, some data made you ask a question and then so on and so forth.
So I just feel like sometimes, like I said, data is a good story, like a quantity, a figure, a number is a good story opener. But what follows is very important, because if you don't substantiate the numbers with the whys, you leave it open to interpretation. So, I mean, there is a lot that we can talk about. If I have to give you maybe, let's say, a couple of examples. If you look at, the Janani Suraksha Yojana that made maternal infant care, healthcare accessible. The attempt was to make it accessible, improve institutional deliveries and all of that. There are these registers that ASHA workers maintain, ANM or ASHA workers maintain to ensure that how many visits has the woman made to the hospital in each trimester and all of those things, right? They have a record. So if you simply look at the record, you see that a lot of women don't meet all the number of meetings, checkups with the doctor required and all that. So some of it is assumed, but it's happened because either she was careless, or she forgot, or she was busy with her own household chores or whatever. But then, at least this is definitely a case in the northern parts of the country, especially the hilly areas. It's baffling how inaccessible healthcare services are, like physically inaccessible. Like some of the villages that I have had a chance to visit, you have to walk 2-3 kilometers minimum. Like the farthest are sometimes 20 kilometers, right? So you are expecting the woman who is carrying a child, who's also very young, there are very young mothers, to go so many times to get their iron tablets or whatever. Of course, there are provisions to take the iron tablets to them. Again, there is another woman who's an ASHA worker who starts her day at 7 a.m. in the morning and goes, walks around 20 kilometers, walks back. Now you want to improve institutional delivery without having proper roads. I'm not even talking about pakka roads, I'm talking about kacha roads. Even that's not there. Even for if a two-wheeler can take the woman to the hospital for the time of delivery, even that is not there. You literally have people carrying women on a chair, like 4 men carrying women on a chair almost. So if you just look at, institutional delivery is very low here. What can we do? The first thing most people will tell you is awareness programs. Let's have awareness. No, but the problem over there may be that there is no road. Okay, and these are places like Uttarkashi, where there is the all-weather road coming up because of the tourism that the place attracts, because of Gangotri, Yamunotri and all the pilgrimage yatras and all that. So there is an all-weather road coming up connecting it to Haridwar. But the internal roads are so poor that women can't access. So what I'm saying is that data needs to be backed with why women are not choosing or opting for institutional delivery.
Understood. So what you're saying...
And just one more small thing that I think is very relevant today. I was just reading a lot the last 2 days about Kerala and violence against women in Kerala. Kerala always shows up as number one. Data says that Kerala is amazing when it comes to gender equality. But there is an issue. There is the systemic issue. Sometimes data is incapable of capturing. Quantitative data is incapable of capturing. It's actually very similar to the Nordic paradox as well. Like Nordic countries have a very good gender equality index or indices, but there is a problem of intimate partner violence, and some of it is being replicated exactly like that in Kerala. So those are the things, and those are the caveats, I think.
So I think both points are extremely interesting and probably whole research areas in themselves. But I think I'm seeing the loop between, we designed an a system for institutional delivery, and it should be working because tick 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 tick. However, why is the ratio so low? But that's where the inquiry starts, right? And it is actually in-field research to go and figure out, fine, these are possible hypothetical reasons, and can we figure out what the actual reason is. Hi, Sruthi, are you there? So
I'm here.
So I think this is bringing to me that and similarly for the other one as well. You said there are well-developed societies which are scoring high perhaps on human development indicators, but there are positive correlates between that and surprisingly, why are levels of violence against women perhaps going up, right? So these are questions, right? Like why questions. So answering them, I think, is non-trivial, and I would say that you can't even copy and paste what somebody else might have done. So would you say that research is required to drive development, and we need researchers who are contextualizing it and asking questions for our context and answering these in like loops of learning. And do you feel that like policy sufficiently incorporates that kind of like inquiry based approach to seeing are we on the right track there? And what would you like to say about evidence and policy? Where could we improve?
I think that's a very interesting question, because I remember recently reading somewhere, and I think you can argue that across the globe now, with the governments across the globe, that there is policy-based evidence. That is, you decide what the policy should be, and then you create evidence accordingly. When it should actually be the other way around, it should be evidence-based policy. So what I'm trying to say essentially is there is this attitude of trying to, develop populist policies, something that will kind of give you the approval of the people and then generate evidence accordingly. That's also another place that we be so careful with data, because data can actually, even though they're just numbers, the whys of the data is so important. If you don't communicate that properly, there's a way you can twist it. You can data starts dancing according to the researcher or the policy maker. So if you're asking me where we are now, I think we are moving towards that dangerous trend of policy-based evidence. This is the policy I want. I will make evidence to support this policy. Okay, that's dangerous. Whether it's gender or whatever else it is, that's very, very dangerous. We need to backtrack. We need to have thorough research and a very, how do you say, very robust relationship between researchers, academia, policymakers, think tanks. What are the sensitization of the people working in these spaces, both in terms of researchers and in terms of policymakers. I would say especially policymakers, because let's just assume that researchers have some theoretical grounding when it comes to different sociological aspects, socio-cultural aspects. That's not there. That's definitely I think it was some project on gender-sensitive urban planning where I was working on, and I happened to speak to a lot of young urban planners. And when we were talking about considering gender-responsive methods of urban planning, they said that what you're saying is great, but none of this is taught to us in school. When we are planning, we're just planning for better commercial aspects. So how can you make this city more livable? But livable also means it has to be more livable for all genders. So the bylaws don't support it. So what they're trying to say is, what I learned from that is that there will be a keen interest if you show them that, look, there is this problem. So if you have urban design, I mean, this is a specific example, urban designers or architects, you tell them this is an issue, how would you solve it? They'd be more than happy to solve it. But you have to show them that there's that problem. Even with policymakers, I think that is an issue. So one, yes, there needs to be theoretical grounding. There needs to be rigorous research, which has to support a policy. But I feel like this is all scattered. There is a lot of gaps. It's fragmented. These processes are fragmented. Communication gap is there.
So what you're saying in a way is that for example, gender hasn't been mainstreamed. It's fragmented.
Yeah.
Right? It's not mainstreamed, and it's not part of every kid's education or every policymaker's education or every architect's education. And perhaps it's because the education system was set up for a previous paradigm, right? So maybe the paradigm in which we're discussing right now, and perhaps many of the people who are listening to this, is the sustainable development paradigm, right? The SDG paradigm, where gender equity is a big, huge component of SDG, and it's widely recognized that creating not just gender justice outcomes or equity outcomes, but also better environmental outcomes. For example, through better reproductive rights, it actually has an impact on populations. That is, in fact, one of the aspects of mitigation, climate mitigation, but also the social aspects and the economic aspects, such as the tremendous value which will be created when women have an equal place in the workforce. Versus previous paradigm, which you were saying, for example, the architectural students know how have been trained how to design for commercial spaces, right? Could you talk a little bit about how these paradigms show up in the way in which we measure progress? For example, we were having a very interesting discussion on how GDP hides something related to gender, which perhaps you'd like to talk about too, so that we can understand where these, how to go through this paradigm shift. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think one thing is that what you started with, the gender has not been mainstream, that even when it comes to governance or policy making, you have a women and child department looking at everything to do with, it's a very patronizing thing to begin with. I want to say that upfront. Like, Women and Child Department looks at everything related to women. But every policy needs to have a gender angle, right? Every policy needs to take into account, actually, gender, caste, everything. I am now speaking from the point of view of gender, but even within gender, let's say if we're talking only about women, within women, there is graded inequality. None of that is spoken about. None of that is taken into consideration. So across, how I would like it is to have some sort of gender mainstreaming body in every department, every ministry, so that every policy goes through that vetting through a gender lens, right? That is one thing. Secondly, when it comes to measuring progress, that's a very interesting conversation. That there could be an entire conversation just on that. Unfortunately, the progress of any nation today or any state is measured based on how much it makes, how economically productive the nation is. Now, this particular parameter that GDP is, unfortunately, does not take into account the labor put in by women, which is largely unpaid labor. Now, there are different systems of national accounting. There are ways to measure unpaid labor as well, but because, as the name suggests, because it does not count as productive economic activity, it does not actually feed into the final figure of the GDP, which is very unfortunate because in agrarian economies like India, where there is a lot of work of animal husbandry, animal rearing, and a lot of the activities that women do, let's say animal husbandry, if you take animal husbandry as an example, a lot of work that women do, collecting, creating compost, feeding cattle with fodder, and all of those things actually gets counted as domestic unpaid work, but it's a very integral part of the agriculture. So that contribution does not even get counted as productive activity. I forget the name of the economist. I think it was Paul Samuelson, an economist, if I'm not wrong. He says it in very simple terms that if was in the US, if a man marries his domestic worker, the GDP will fall. So essentially, what he's saying is, for as long as she was paying her to do the domestic work, as soon as they're married, in many ways, I don't know, it's very patronizing, I think, the example, but if you have to put it in one line, what the value of unpaid work is, it's basically that. Now, this is, of course, in a country like America, let's say, where domestic labor is accounted for, and the whole issue of formal and informal sector is less stark to India. But I think that example drives home the point of not accounting, or is counted really. That's the simple question. Whose work is counted? Whose work is left for? And I think this translates into so many things. Like over the last 1 year, there has been conversation about how the ASHA workers are the backbone of India's healthcare and all of those things. But if ASHA workers, the work they actually do, it's an extension of what a woman does at home. Yeah. Health is a woman's subject at home, right? It's a mother's subject at home. Even in 2021. So an ASHA worker's work is seen as an extension of that, what she does to the village. And that's why she's underpaid. I feel like that's one of the main reasons why such a part of the health ecosystem is so undervalued and so underpaid. I feel if a man would have been doing that job, the pay would be much better, and they still have to go on strikes and all of those things. For regular pay, it's really terrible how these things translate. What is considered as economic activity?
That's just such a hidden story, and I think it's the onus is on us to figure out how to discuss these things and unhide them, collect data about them, bring them into the discourse, navigate the treacherous territories of trying to understand these things and not be patronizing about it. And I think it's like a can of worms actually, and I don't know if there's a research agenda to bring this into the public sphere and into and engage it into policy. But I hope that perhaps in the next generation of design which we'll have to do in order to bring gender justice and move towards sustainable development, these factors can be considered, because I think the story which I'm getting is the data itself, sometimes the indicators are hiding all these stories, and we need to go back to the drawing board and see whether we have the right indicators. So hopefully somebody who's listening to this can also do these. I think there are a lot of worthwhile indicators, perhaps from the SDGs and so on and so forth, but perhaps we have to start thinking in terms of what fits for measuring how we're making progress. Maybe GDP is the wrong story from so many different aspects. So great discussing with you, Shruti. You've given me a lot of food for thought. Honestly speaking, understanding gender is hard for somebody who was brought up in the system in certain ways. Many of these topics are very new, and I hope we can have more conversations around this in our society, so that at least the questions are mainstreamed, even if the answers are contentious and debated. So with that, we'll wrap up with the final question is, what are your 3 wishes, if you could have them, in order to make your work and your vision of what you are doing with your work and your impact to come true? If you could just wave a wand and have those wishes.
Okay, they're wishes, so they can be anything, no?
They can be anything.
So, so I think we spoke so much about data. I think one thing that always is at the back of my head is we speak so much about women's labor force participation, and let's talk about the formal sector now for the time being. I feel like there's no attempt or no serious determination to really find evidence about workplace harassment, evidence in the sense data. About the number of instances, how can we solve this issue, because it's a big issue. Already in informal sector, it's terrible. It's as it is very terrible, and we need to take efforts to make sure that, and there are so many women across, so many factory workers, so many women across board resisting it, protesting it. You will see it in the newspaper every second day. I feel like there's no work that's being done over there. There is hardly any data. Where there can be data, that is in the formal sector, there can be data, but if there hasn't been any concerted effort to get any centralized system of documenting the instances of sexual harassment, because a lot of these figures will also feed into why a lot of women are not in workplaces. Why do women like home-based jobs? Why do women like setting up their own business or whatever? Or why is it that they are suddenly out of a job, for no good reason, despite qualifications and all of that? And that's one very important thing. Secondly, I think transparent, clean data, like with gender disaggregated data, gender indicators is very important. I think that's a given. Everybody needs that now. And the third, and probably the most important thing for me, I think we covered it in many ways, is that whether it's the research process or decision-making process or policy-making process, there needs to be better representation of all groups, not just women. Scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, transgender persons, because a lot of answers will come when you have people narrating their lived experiences, because they have already thought of a solution that some of us may not even have considered. So I think that that for me this is a big wish actually, because no matter how hard you try, I have realized that representation is always a work in progress, and I don't think we are nowhere close to saying that we've achieved it. Whether it's a panel discussion or it's a committee, a standing committee set up by the parliament, whatever it is,
or boards of companies, or
see, market is. I have always had a problem with the way the free market functions. It's not free at all. It's not a level playing field at all. Because that's another discussion altogether. I mean, we could start with something as simple as Narega Act, right? The Mahatma Gandhi National Rule. That act actually said that we are going to pay men and women equal for the equal amount of work they do, number of hours of work clocked in. Which market-based company has done that? So when it comes to free market and their policies, I have big issues with. But I'm saying let's at least start with policy making and the research process where it's accepted that there is a clear issue here and we need to address it. Why I say that is because I feel in the market realm there is a fair bit of denial of these problems, systemic issues. So if on the side where you have accepted and acknowledged it, if you're not making an attempt to improve things, then I wouldn't expect much from the market. So,
well, we have a long way to go, but I think having people like you and others in the field is it's really heartening, and most likely some of the people who are watching this might be inspired to also take up similar career paths. So data collection.
Can I just interject? It's fine. You can take whatever career paths you want. Just keep these things in mind wherever you are, because it's so much more important to mainstream these things in, let's say, an advertising company or wherever you're working, in your own startup.
Understood. So, yeah. No, that's a very, I think, a critical point. We don't need more specialists, perhaps we do, but we also need more mainstreaming of these ideas to whatever it is which you might be doing, right? And that requires individuals to start thinking about their choices and the consequences on the world, how they engage with the things around them. So very thought-provoking interview, Shruthi. I mean, honestly speaking, I'm floored, but that's not surprising given that I'm a man who perhaps is learning a lot when it comes to how things are perceived by other genders. But your 3 points of data collection around issues of critical importance, transparency, and inclusive design, I think hold for a lot of issues, even outside gender, but specifically for gender. It's super important to get these right. And wishing you all the best with your work so that you can engage these into action. Thank you so much for being part of our Data4SDG interview. Bye-bye.
Thank you. I think these are great platforms, and I hope that these conversations go somewhere in the policy realm or whatever, wherever. Whoever is listening, I hope that this has been some takeaway has come out of this.
No, I'm sure there is. There definitely is. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hari. Thank you.
Yeah.